Rich, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to see you again, and I appreciate the opportunity to sit down with you and to cover some of the critical issues in real-world evidence. I wanted to get started by asking you, from the decades of experience that you have working in this field, can you cast a critical eye on the state of real-world evidence? And tell us from your perspective how you would describe how well we are doing from the perspective of different stakeholders, like researchers, regulators, payers, and patients. What are we doing well, and what needs to get better?
Yeah, well, thank you, Patty, and thank you for having me on this program today. I really have been looking forward to this. So to start with, let me start with the researcher and kind of work through those stakeholders, because as you point out, they all have a different vantage and probably see different benefits and maybe have realized different benefits, and maybe some are still not quite realized. So for the researcher, real world evidence has opened the door to a far greater understanding of what works for who and at what cost, in actual practice. And we've moved from 2 decades of claims data, may even be more than that, to a better, but still I'd say early understanding of the benefits of clinical and now even omics data. And as that understanding of what I believe is the much greater value of clinical real world data propagates, we're going to see more complex and elegant research designs. And and when I talk to researchers who are working with the data, it's still new for them to be working with EMR data, but they're like kids in a candy store in terms of what they see as being possible. We're already seeing real world evidence help find patients for trials, or to help plan smaller trials, or to project standard of care control arms for patients so that earlier decisions can be made on stopping a drug, potentially saving tens of millions of dollars. Clinical data overall is revealing so much more about biology, natural history, and real world effectiveness. And we're getting data from ever larger sample sizes than could be traditionally collected. So that's the researcher. For the regulator, I'm going to use a metaphor they may not like, but the real world evidence is a bit like a wild horse that needs to be tamed. I mean, I'd say that regulators in the US, have invested in real world data, particularly for safety signal, think Sentinel, and in some oncology use cases, think rare conditions, and for large diagnostic studies. But it's only been in the last 2 years that they have outlined what the saddle needs to look like for manufacturers to ride that horse towards a submission. And I think there's still a lot of confusion as to what regulators will accept for post-marketing purposes, for newer expanded labels, et cetera. But the FDA in particular has been making that increasingly clear, and they are using real world evidence. As you know, the FDA has reported on its own results, and on the drug side, found that from January 2019 to June 2021, of 116 approvals, 88 included a real world evidence study, and the majority influenced the decision. And by their report, almost half were included in the product label. So I think that's really a lot of forward motion in a relatively short period of time. And if we think about how the FDA views, real world data, it's kind of a three-legged stool. First, whether the real world data itself is fit for use for the regulatory purpose, whether the study design can answer the regulatory question, and then whether the conduct of collecting and analyzing the data meets the FDA regulatory requirements. And I think that's something that we'll come back to perhaps in this conversation and drill into that a little bit more. The third stakeholder is, of course, patients. For many of us, that's the first stakeholder because we're all patients at some level. And I think the promise of real world evidence is to tell a particular patient what their likely path is and what treatments are most likely to be effective for them. And for several reasons, we're not yet at the point where patients are seeing those benefits, but it is coming, and it is coming potentially quickly. And then I think we can dig into the payer a bit. I know you know that space very well. I think payers have underutilized real world evidence beyond their own access to claims data. And yet I believe that they're probably the stakeholder group other than patients that will ultimately benefit the most from it. So there's a lot more to be done there.
So I'm interested, just staying a little bit on the regulators. To
Yeah.
me, my way of thinking with the 21st century cures having been lobbed from Congress onto FDA and to the manufacturers, it seems to me to be a really good example of a partnership that came from perhaps something that wasn't viewed as particularly beneficial, or it was a mountain that was very high for FDA to climb, yet they did in a very iterative fashion and in a way rather expeditiously provided guidance, maybe not as fast as all of us wish, but from a governmental standpoint, they certainly did respond in kind. And the progress that we've made in just 6 or 7 years in a notoriously slow moving industry, to me, is something that we can look upon with favorability.
Yeah, no, I totally agree on that. I think that the FDA, and to some extent the European, the EMEA, have, when we think about that three-legged stool, have made it much more clear how data can be collected and utilized, what validation parameters are going to be needed, and whether the design can potentially answer the regulatory question. I think we're still trying to learn what's fit for use, and that may differ or does differ by different therapeutic areas and different schools of thought, even within the FDA. So there's still a lot of learning to happen, and a lot more case studies that the whole industry needs to understand, what the FDA will view as a fit for use case for real world data in some instances.